introduce yourself, whatever facts you think are important. So,
Sure. My name is Bobby Pakzad-Hurson. I'm an assistant professor of economics at Brown. I've been studying labor markets and more recently policies aimed at closing the gender wage gap. And I guess wage inequality in general, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit today. And we're friends from middle school, high school, college.
Yeah, we've known each other for quite a while. All right, good. So yeah, we're going to be talking about some economics today, which is pretty far away from my specialty, but that's okay. I do quite like politics and especially political debates. I do follow those sometimes, and economics are a big part of that, especially how we organize our labor and our labor markets. So often in these debates come up and you hear two sides arguing, and one side kind of frames the argument as in a market economy, you know, these are usually the more like libertarian free market types. Say in a market, people are paid what they're worth, right? And then the other side argues it's like, no, you're actually paid what you can negotiate. And this normally comes from like the left-wing progressive types. And me just listening as sort of an outsider, just like, I don't know, these two seem reasonable, seem true. Maybe they're even like the same thing, just different perspectives. So yeah, like it's hard to kind of tell. And they're kind of moralistic too, these way of framing these things. And so I wanted to just look at like, what do these things actually mean? Like, let's dive deeper and see if these are accurate ways of representing the economy and our labor force.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there are, two sides to this argument. And I think that the field of economics has kind of shifted a little bit in its thinking as well.
So I would think of tackling a problem like this, I would look at, sort of first principles. Let's say like, okay, how do we figure out the value of something? And if I were to look at, let's just take your job, for example, you're a professor. Yeah. And be like, okay, so what do? You teach students and you get paid to teach students.
That's
so
right.
You would like, and this is something you can more or less calculate. You could say, I teach this many students, they pay this per credit, and maybe you get funding from grants or something, and the university takes some percentage of that. But yeah, basically your income comes from these two pretty quantifiable sources. Yeah. And you can calculate that fairly easily at the end. But like, I'm guessing that's not what you did when you were going to your employer and saying, I want a job with you, this is my value.
It was more in the other direction, where I was told, here's a number, and there was a little bit of negotiating. But I think you're right. What determines a wage is maybe a complicated question, right? So part of it, as you say, maybe I'm like on a factory line and I make a certain number of widgets. This is kind of the classic economic example. I make 20 widgets per hour, and you can sell each widget for, I don't know, $1 or $2. And okay, you can pretty easily there quantify how much revenue I bring into you. To the firm, how much I get paid, then am I paid the entire thing? Well, probably not, right? The firm has some expenses, they have some overhead, maybe I have some benefits. Ultimately, the owners of the firm probably want to make some kind of profit, or else they're not going to be interested in doing it. They might have to have a supervisor to make sure I keep working. All of these things cut into, we can think of this as a wedge between what I bring in and what I take home. But there are market forces that determine exactly how much I get paid, which is in some sense divorced from just the individual amount of the revenue that I produce.
Yeah, hopefully they're at least correlated somehow, right?
Yeah.
They reflect each other, but at least hopefully, you as an individual looking at your value, you're not doing this calculation. You're looking to the market, and you're right. Basically the selling power of your labor.
And right. And so there, we're talking about market forces now, and this is kind of the standard basis of a lot of at this point foundational economic models, and how we thought about labor markets for a long time, which is, okay, there is a certain amount that I'm worth to a firm. This may depend on exactly the job I'm doing, but also depends on other factors in the market. So, for example, if there are a lot of other firms and there are a lot of workers, right? But the firms really want the workers, right? There's quite a large demand. Then my price may be the wage I get may be driven up, and we can talk about exactly what these forces are and how they come into play. But there are a lot of other things, as you alluded to, and about, well, what happens when, I don't know exactly how much I'm worth? What happens when the firm has some kind of labor market power, right? They can, they can, de facto prevent me from going to another employer, or there, there are a lot of frictions preventing me from jumping ship and going elsewhere. Do they kind of are they able to kind of squeeze me for more than I would otherwise, than maybe in other settings? Yeah.
Yeah. So generally, what we're talking about here then is a market, and specifically your labor market. And in this case, you're selling labor. In this case, so normally we think of it as like, okay, you're buying and there's people selling to you. But in this case,
that's right.
It's just it follows very similar supply and demand, right? That's sort of the classic.
Right. And as you put it, this is like a little bit different, because now the firm is not selling you a CD, or I really dated myself here, selling you an iPhone. They're buying labor from you, and you're the seller, right? So the positions are reversed, but the forces are kind of similar. So I think that maybe the most basic way to think about this is, let's think about a market with a lot of different firms and a lot of workers, and well, there are some returns to having workers, right? The firms need somebody to press the buttons on the machine, or to ice the cakes, or whatever it is that the firm is doing. And we might think that there are what economists call decreasing returns to labor, right? So the first worker you have is really, really important, because, well, without one worker, there's no one to press the buttons, right? Your factory shuts down. But if you have 1 million workers, that million and first worker is not going to be quite as productive, because well, you already have people using the machines, and to have the million and first worker using the machine, they're going to have to kick someone else off the machine or something like that. So the idea is that workers become less productive as you have more and more of them, on a marginal level, under each additional one. And then just so that kind of determines the demand for labor, right? So the more expensive labor is in the market, right? If we just think of there's a single price for labor, then you're not going to hire as many workers, right? Because the idea is each additional worker that's hired is less valuable than the previous one, and so at some point you're just going to stop. And the higher the price is, then the fewer workers are hired. On the other hand, there's a supply curve of labor, so how much the workers are willing to work for, and you might think some workers are willing to work for more money than others, right? That each person has like kind of a bare minimum. And so the higher the price is, the higher the wages, the more people are willing to work. And that's kind of where we get this intersection. So the supply curve is upward sloping. The more you pay, the more people are going to be hired. And on the other hand, the higher the pay is, the fewer workers the firm is going to demand. And so we have this, downward sloping demand curve. And the intersection of these is kind of the market equilibrium, the competitive equilibrium, where so-called markets clear, right? There's no firm who wants to hire the next worker, because at the price of labor, you're hiring the exact number of workers, so that if you hired one more worker, you'd be paying that worker more than they're bringing in at the marginal level, and no worker is who's not working is willing to work, because, well, you're already getting the workers who are willing to work for that wage, and anyone who's not working yet is would require a higher wage to work. And so that's how the market's clear, and that's the kind of like classical intersection of supply and demand that determines the market wage and how many.
Yeah. So I guess my main question about that is, when you think about sort of the modern supply chains and like our modern labor force, it doesn't seem to reflect that very well. It seems to me like as you get more complicated and more people, you actually produce more value from each person's work, because you allow specialization. You allow, like, let's say, to produce a car, one person can't actually produce a car, or else it'd be like a terrible one, maybe. And then as you get more people with more specialization, increasing that supply chain, you can get more cars and better cars. And by adding more people, you actually like overall increase the value of each person added to that.
So I think you're absolutely right. There's the story I told was one where all the workers are kind of exactly the same. They can all do the same job, and all the firms are kind of the same. And I think there are differences on both sides. So you might think of, well, there are different jobs, and as you said, a firm who wants to make a car can't just hire a metal worker, right? They have to have an engineer, and they have to have somebody to program the crash dummies and things like that, right? So it requires quite a lot. We could think of this as, basically the firm has, each firm again has has a need for all sorts of these different jobs. And, maybe these are completely separate markets where, you go to one market and you hire the engineer, you go to the other market and you hire the metal worker. But probably there are some spillovers across these markets as well, right? So if the price of, for whatever reason, steel goes up and you can't, you're not able to hire as many steel workers because the price of steel is too high. You can't afford enough steel to pay your entire, metal worker force. You cut back on that. Probably you're going to cut back on the engineers as well because your whole, cost of production has gone up. So I think, the analogy I told is imperfect. Our models can kind of accommodate different types of workers, but you're absolutely right that the truth is more complicated, and there are spillovers across different jobs, and like the full market, if you think about it, is more complicated, but clears, at least in these models, in a kind of similar way.
Yeah, so basically you're describing then we don't really describe the labor market as actually one market, right? There's a bunch of markets and people are buying and selling in sort of these different labor markets, depending on their specialty, their training, all these different things, right?
The textbook models frequently treat them, just in isolation.
Okay.
I don't think we need to. In fact, many of our modern tools don't treat them as one, or do treat them as kind of one overall market. But
okay.
but you're absolutely right that the analogy I told breaks down a little bit at some point when you're thinking about these things.
To me, this is like where the discussion usually comes up of like skilled versus unskilled labor, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is sort of like the big distinction of how we draw labor markets. You have like a skilled labor, you have a specific profession that you'd like to do, and there's a labor or there's a market for, let's say, doctors. You're looking in the market for doctors. You're not trying to be something else. Yeah. And but then there's unskilled, which is like there's not as much training or skills. It's just picking up. Yeah. So let's kind of go through some of these levels of skill and how that changes the market and how. Okay. So I guess just start with unskilled labor. You want to talk about that a little bit, kind of what that means and how market forces kind of affect that, because this one to me kind of seems the closest to what you were talking about before, where the supply and demand, and it's pretty straightforward because like more or less anyone can do these sort of unskilled labor jobs, right?
Yeah, and I think without being without taking a stance on the value of labor, right? I think your definition is in a lot of ways correct. I think the way we think of unskilled labor as something that is fast to adjust because it's very easy to transition from one job to another, which isn't to say that certain quote unquote unskilled labor jobs are not difficult or there aren't returns to skill, but the idea
or aren't important. Like every job, every employer needs a janitor. Like they're probably so oftentimes the most important people that work there, but it's not like their value or their importance, because everyone needs a janitor, but like it doesn't mean you're going to pay them the most, because you can get janitors from a lot of different places.
Right. But I think that roughly speaking, a working definition that we can use for unskilled labor is something where people can transition very quickly in or out of that role. This is potentially different from a skilled labor we might think of as doctors. If the wage of doctors for whatever reason went up by a factor of 10 today, right? I can't become a doctor tomorrow. I might want to become a doctor tomorrow, but that's not available to me. Whereas, we might think in unskilled labor, if the price of the job went up by a factor of 10, tomorrow I could go apply for a job and
Sure. And people doing similar jobs with similar skills can kind of shift around to fill these markets based on these sort of specific demands.
Right. And so we might think of skilled labor as something that requires education, training, or some kind of natural ability that I can't go and play in the NBA. That's a form of skilled labor, right? It's not quite so easy to transition into that job. So so I think for besides potential investments that people have to make in order to qualify for these jobs, we might think of these as being relatively less responsive in the short run to changes in the market.
Okay. And then so something else with these skilled jobs is, so your training, you said already, you can't transition very well because it takes a lot of time to develop the skills to enter into these markets. But at the same time, you're also kind of narrowing the market that you can enter into. Like there's not as many doctor jobs as there, like if you're
That's right.
trained as a doctor, there's not as many jobs for that as there are sort of these unskilled labor jobs, right?
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right that there is a high degree of what economists call human capital accumulation in order to become a doctor, but it's very narrow, right?
Mhm.
So
But yet their
that's
wages are still high, even
the
though there's
wages are
less
high,
jobs
right?
for that
Right. But
because of the
if
skill.
right, I'm just saying if we invented robots tomorrow that could cure us of all the diseases we know of, right? It's possible that in that world, people who spent their time in medical school are going to regret it, right? They're
Sure.
not able to transfer those skills quite as easily to other jobs,
Hmm.
and so that's kind of what I was saying. The skilled labor is kind of a double-edged sword, right? Because it's hard to transition in or out of that. If there are market forces that kind of these would have to be extreme, but tank an industry, really, like the magical robot who cures everyone. Those skills are not going to be useful or as useful in other fields. Whereas if one is in an unskilled job, a robot comes in who can do it. Well, it may be relatively easier to transfer to another kind of unskilled job.
Okay, sure. And that's what we see a lot of times now is it's typically, although with AIs getting smarter and smarter,
Mhm.
kind of these kind of distinctions that way aren't quite as clear, where we see like smart AIs that are doing image analysis that only humans could do before, and that's a skilled job versus,
Yeah.
so it's kind of interesting that way. But
And I think you're picking up on something else there. If it's this definition of like the ease of jumping from one job to another, it may also be that it's easier to design machines to do unskilled jobs, right? So if there's something that doesn't require a whole lot of training or something that most people are able to do with possibly with a little bit of training, it may also be easier to construct a robot to do that. Now, I don't think that's necessarily always the case.
I
So
think that's
um,
right.
so we have, of course, you go to the grocery store now, and they're the robot checkout machines.
Hmm.
We might think of that as kind of like AI, uh, broadly defined, replacing unskilled labor. But for your listeners who are a little bit older, 20 years ago, travel agents were still pretty popular.
Yeah.
And I don't think that was viewed as kind of like an unskilled job. There was some while that went into it, right? People had to, know how to call the right airlines and things like that.
There's some networking, some communication with your client, yeah.
Exactly, right. And that's something that we might say was a somewhat of a skilled job that was replaced almost entirely, I think, by machines and the computer. So
Mhm.
so it's not that we're all safe, regardless of where we are and kind of like where what kind of jobs we work in. But we might expect that the jobs that we define as unskilled in this definition might be more susceptible to being replaced by computers. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And my understanding too is that these skilled labor markets often have higher gaps in their salaries as well. Is that right?
Higher gaps between individual workers.
Between individual workers, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. So as soon when workers start to specialize, they become harder to replace in some sense, right? So
Mm.
um, far be it from me to say I'm the world's greatest economist or anything like that, but at least the classes I teach at Brown, is it possible that someone else could teach them? Of course, but would anyone else be kind of step in on day one and be able to and know the material I do that I teach to the class? Maybe not as much, right? So
Okay.
so I'm somewhat unique in that realm, and you might think that when people are somewhat unique, well, it's not so easy to go to them and say, hey, I guess we're going to talk about negotiations and a more complicated wage setting process coming up. But if I'm irreplaceable and the firm comes to me and says, take this pay cut, or I'm not going to give you a raise, or something like that, I can say, well, I know that this is going to hit you in the pocketbook. I don't I don't believe your bluff. Give me more.
Hmm.
Whereas if it's clear that there's a line of people outside the door who could do exactly my job the next day, I kind of don't have the ability to call the bluff, because it's not really a bluff to say that I can find someone else to do your job.
Hmm.
And because of that, if one worker is kind of unique in some way, and even if it's high skilled, right? If you going back to the doctor analogy, if there's only one cardiologist but there are three dermatologists, right? You might think, okay, the cardiologist is going to command quite a high wage because that person is relatively more irreplaceable. And that might be the reason for higher wage gaps.
Okay, sure. And would you consider like more creative jobs as just a part of this skilled labor, like let's say artists or athletes?
Of course, I could go, start playing basketball tomorrow and claim I'm an athlete. I wouldn't consider myself a skilled laborer, right? Even if I could find somebody to pay me, they quickly realize they shouldn't. But even if they did, I think I'd be very easy to replace at that level. So I think that part of what makes someone a skilled laborer, in these kind of creative fields, is probably natural talent or a natural ability or kind of honed ability.
Just somehow you create a demand for your brand, right? And that's
right.
a big deal with artists, right? They're talking about branding, right? Because that's your unique thing, and that's what you're trying to sell, and you create a demand for who you are.
I think I'd probably characterize people at the artists or the athletes that we might know and hear about on the news. I think it's hard to deny that that's a form of very skilled labor, right? They're not replaceable. In the case of athletes, they have employers. They're not easy to replace. It's intuitively, right, it's also not something that somebody could just pick up and do the next day.
There's probably a lot of other factors that affect the supply and demand. The skills and the markets for those skills are quite a big driving factor for some of these like wage differences and demands that we see. But there are definitely other economic factors, kind of external, especially external to the labor, the person selling their labor, right? So let's just kind of go in and talk about some of those. A couple quick ones that like basically affect the employer's ability to pay. That'll change what you're being paid as a worker, right? So the first one is pretty simple that I saw is just there is an ability paid. Basically, just the profitability of the job that's being done affects the ability for the employer to pay more. So like, let's take an example of like a mine. You can have a gold mine or you can have a copper mine, and it's kind of the same job, but one's obviously way more productive than the other one. So the gold mine is going to be able to pay their workers more because they're making more money for kind of doing the same thing, right?
Right. So if there were two mines right next to one another, one of them was gold, one of them was copper, they had the same amount of each, and it's equally easy to mine, but gold sells for a higher price, then absolutely, right? The gold mine could, in principle, pay more than the copper mine, without going under. At some point, there's some wage that the copper mine would say, that's too much, I can't recoup my costs, I'm just going to shut down, if that's the wage, where the gold mine would keep going.
So if you're a worker, you want to go looking for the jobs that are closer to the gold mines than the copper mines, right?
So I think if you're able to capitalize on that value, right? If you're able to get a higher share of your worth to the firm, absolutely.
Okay, and then there's another one. It's similar to the skilled value, but there's also, let's say, a cost of training. So maybe this is very specific to your job or your employer, and it takes some time to do this specific job where you fit into the company, and so they train you, and then they'll pay you more because I guess it's similar to the skilled labor, where it's harder to replace you then because it costs more to bring somebody else on board and to train them, and it takes time. And so that's just another thing. So
we might think of like all sorts of costs being, that the firm might have other than kind of the direct wage they pay you, right? There's cost of materials, there's cost of, insurance, of rent for the factory, there's cost of training, as you say, maybe there's childcare they have to pay for, right? So there, the labor is one aspect of the entire production process, and many of those other things cost money. And to take your gold and copper analogy, right? Suppose there was a computer chip that needed to be made with gold, and there's another computer chip that needed to be made with copper. I think that this is probably unlikely, but you might imagine that the cost of gold is much higher, and so even if the chips do exactly the same sort of thing, the factory that uses gold in the chips is not going to be able to pay the workers as much, if they had to, because their cost of inputs are higher.
And all these things kind of change how the dynamics of negotiating a wage happen, right? All these different cost factors factor into this negotiation. So now, go ahead and talk about monopsony, I think, because this is another big factor that we see that can affect how you negotiate salaries, and it's not necessarily tied to their ability to pay, but the company's willingness to pay, right, or their
Right.
ability to negotiate. And so it's kind of not tied necessarily to the material factors, but more to the market factors.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
So I guess maybe first to define it, I guess the word. So one thing I've noticed is that computers, Microsoft Word, Google Docs, right? They don't know the word monopsony. Right?
Okay.
This squiggly red line. So monopoly, I think we're all familiar with. So monopoly is what, a single seller of a good. Monopsony means single buyer, right? And so in this case, right, we're talking about firms buying labor from workers who sell it. And so that means, we're talking about markets with a single firm. Maybe that's not a single firm, but this gives us a framework to think about it, at least, where, when we talk about monopsony models, we mean markets where there are a few firms who have some say in the market, right? So if they change the way they set their wages, that's going to cause changes in the entire market. And so
I had a question about this too.
Yeah.
So we often describe monopolies or monopsonies as like there's one thing and it's a monolith and it's like very clearly, but like even in monopolies that we've kind of seen in real life that we've had the government come in and break up. It's not like we don't really ever see like a true 100%. This is the only person. This is the only place where you can get it. There's always similar things, but it's more like this one firm or company just dominates the market. Like they own some significant percentage of it. So it's not like, it's not the only, but it's like, or maybe it's a couple like we see with, I don't know, broadband carriers. Even though you don't control the whole thing, just controlling some significant percentage really still gives you a lot of power in the market.
That's right. So I think, you've picked up on an important thing, which is when we define monopsony or monopoly, it's probably on a sliding scale, right? Where you might think of, in one extreme, there's one producer that makes everything. You're right that it's kind of hard to think about this. One example of a recent lawsuit of a kind of monopsony situation is mixed martial arts. So there's a lawsuit against the UFC, the biggest organization, and by all accounts, the UFC kind of accounts for like 85% of like all of the sales and the best fighters in the space. And the question is that enough to be a monopsony? And that's kind of the case before the judge. And so it's not quite so easy to determine hey, you are or not a monopolist or a monopsonist, but there are different notions of kind of market power and market concentration that we can use. But I think intuitively we have the sense that like, well, Apple is something like a monopolist when it comes to selling, in the space of smartphones. Maybe the UFC is something like a monopsonist in the space of buying the talent of fighters in a way that maybe there's probably not an equivalent for janitors, as you brought up. There's not like a single entity that hires 80% of all the janitors in the world.
Okay, yeah, sure. And so my understanding then is that when these sort of monopsonies pop up, the reason they cause issues is because they have more power to hire, or they have more power to affect the rate at which they're able to hire people, right? Because they don't need to pay more to attract labor. They just automatically do by virtue of being the only game in town, and therefore they're able to hire people at a lower rate, right?
Right. And so comparing back to the lots of small firms that kind of buy up labor, if one of those firms, one of the million firms says, hey, you know what, I know that the market wage is kind of $20 an hour, I only feel like paying $15 an hour, right? No one's going to go work for them, right? Somebody else, those workers are just going to find jobs at at the kind of 999,000 other firms that are kind of basically the same. And so no individual firm has the ability to really cut down on prices. But if there's a single buyer, in this case, a monopsony, what can the firm do, right? It can say, look, I realize I could pay a high wage and, kind of pay a wage up until the point where, I'm basically getting no additional value out of the marginal guy, right? So if I'm paying a wage of $20 an hour to everyone, and I hire, I don't know, 1,000 workers. The 1,001st worker is not worth $20 an hour. That's kind of like what we think of as the kind of competitive equilibrium. But instead, the monopsonist might say, hey, look, I could just pay $10 an hour. I won't hire as many people. I know that, but I'm making a big profit off of each of them.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so this is exactly what we predict in the models when the firm has kind of full ability to set prices, but it has to set a single price for all the workers. And what it's going to do is it's going to undercut the kind of competitive wage. It's going to hire fewer people, but it's going to make a larger profit as a result of paying each of the workers that it hires relatively.
And that's sort of what we see from an outsider perspective. Why we don't like this sort of thing happening is because they're actually producing less value for the general public, because they're producing less, they're hiring less people, but they're creating higher margins of profit for themselves.
Right. So it's a little bit of a, maybe a little bit of a tough puzzle to wrap our heads around. But I think the analogy is something like this. The monopsonist can do the following. Instead of taking the entire pie and splitting it in half, right? It creates a smaller pie, but it takes a much larger slice. And so as a result, it's getting more money, but it's creating less total value. And there's the term that economists use for the part that's kind of the size difference between the two pies is the deadweight loss. So this is kind of something that's just trades that could have happened that are not realized in the market because of the profit motive of the monopsonist. Yeah.
Okay, and this power all comes from basically the unequal power of the employer, the person hiring the labor. I think we covered that pretty well. Let's kind of shift to ways that the laborers can sort of organize themselves to become more powerful in, let's say, a union or something, where they have sort of an organized, and then they have sort of a block of selling power in not exactly in the same way as a monopsony, but they're sort of coordinated, and then they can combine their efforts, and then it's more of one block selling to a bunch of employers.
That's right. Yeah. So we might think of this as like an unevenness of bargaining power or something like that. And I think you're right. So maybe the example that we were talking about before is really there's one show in town in an unskilled labor market, right? So all the work, there are a lot of workers. At least it's feasible to kind of replace them with someone else, but there's only one firm in town. And maybe in markets with skilled labor, kind of the power is a little more balanced, and there's room for more negotiation. As you say, there might be unions where the workers can kind of band together and say, well, we know you're the only show in town, but now we're collectively the only show in town for where you can buy labor as well. Mm-hmm. And so this, exactly might result in something where even though there's a single firm in town, we kind of end up somewhere between the competitive equilibrium outcome, which is relatively higher number of people employed and higher wage, and the monopsony outcome, which is lower in both. So we might bargain to somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I want to go into a little bit more about unions, just because you see unionization efforts coming up over the country, and I think it's kind of interesting to delve into like their impact, kind of how they even get started, things like that. So we talked about their influence in the market and how they're able to basically drive up wages, which I think is like, it's just a true statement that that's one thing that they do, right? That's something they usually tend to negotiate for. And it's just like, you see just empirically where there's unions, sort of these industries pay higher wages, right?
Right. So unionization, I know this has come up in the context of Amazon, I think in the last year or so, but it's broadly speaking on the decline. So right now, about 10% of the U.S. workforce is unionized, and this is much higher. I don't know the exact kind of peak of this, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was a third or half of workers at some point that were unionized. That's not the same in all countries. So I know that Austria, I was looking this up recently, has something like 99.7% of its workforce is under some kind of collective bargaining agreement.
Wow.
And that 10% to basically 100%, there's a big difference. And I think a lot of this is because unionization is in some sense not natural, right? So if we think about this, it seems kind of natural to have a kind of rich factory owner who's the only show in town. but kind of by virtue of the fact that they're hiring factory workers, well, those factory workers are not going to be rich like the factory owner, and so how do we get the workers to band together, right? We need to somehow solve this collective action problem. And you might think of, if there's just one person who says, hey, let me start a union, the factory owner is just going to get rid of them quickly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
we've
so,
seen that.
Yeah, we've seen that. Right. And so that's why unionization depends kind of heavily on governmental protections. So in the United States, about 100 years ago, there was the National Labor Relations Act that was passed, and that basically protected the right of workers to talk to one another, to plan, to unionize, right? So firms are not able to say, hey, Matt, I hear you're unionizing, goodbye, right? And we might think that government protections are very important. Perhaps kind of naturally speaking, the more protections there are, we might think that unionization rates will be higher. Although I think that also depends possibly on the nature of work, right? If there are many workers who are doing kind of similar jobs, it might be easier to unionize than well, if I'm the only cardiologist in town, who am I gonna, it's less obvious that maybe my need for a union is less obvious, but also probably my ability to unionize is lower. But getting back to your earlier point, I think that you're right that we do have evidence that workplaces that are unionized compared to similar workplaces, they may have different, kind of pay standards. So there, I think broadly speaking, we see we see more pay compression in unionized jobs. So there isn't as much differences between pay differences between kind of similar workers, and I think generally the pay is higher as well. Although there's some question as to whether that's directly caused by the union or other factors that also lead to unionization.
Okay, that's interesting. And are there cases where maybe it doesn't make sense to unionize? I mean, we see it happening in sort of like these big industries or these big companies. There's an effort to get everyone in the industry, but like you said, Austria has almost all of their workforce. Does it make sense to, like, if you have a lot of small companies, like is there, like, I don't know, 10 people in your company and 7 of them are the general just day-to-day workers? Does it make sense for them to unionize or?
Yeah, I mean, far be it from me to tell every worker, when they should or shouldn't unionize. But I think broadly speaking, there may be some workers who are opposed to unionization, even in industries that do have unionization. So, for example, if I'm the superstar in a particular type of job, and unionization results in pay compression, right? Mm-hmm. Well, probably it's not going to end up going so well for me, right? So you might think that the star earners are kind of happy to kind of like have a more like a eat what you kill attitude that puts fewer constraints on kind of what they're paid relative to other workers. Others, may not be as interested. So, workplaces where workers have particular skills, again, there might be a more even kind of share of the bargaining power to begin with, right? If I'm the only cardiologist in town and you're the only hospital in town, yeah, we both have kind of need for one another, and we may be able to split the surplus in some way because neither of us has a credible fallback option really, and so there might not be as much of a need for unionization, and so we might think that unskilled labor might be a kind of natural candidate for when unionization is most valuable.
Interesting. Okay, and what about government jobs? Like we see police and teachers unions, and sort of the right wing and left wing each complains about the respective union for each one because they cause issues negotiating. And because it's weird in that case, right? Because I guess there is a market still for both of these jobs, but
that's right.
Is it different because it's a government job and they get different benefits? Or I didn't really understand why that would even be different than a normal labor union.
Yeah, so we do see actually relatively higher rates of unionization for public sector jobs in the U.S. Now, why is that? I think perhaps there are a couple of reasons. One is that, well, maybe it's easier for employers to private employers to sabotage unionization efforts in some way, that like it's probably hard for hopefully it's harder for government employees to do those kinds of government managers to do those kind of actions. In terms of the role of unionization, I think this has been kind of a debate that is in public sector jobs. I think this is something that came to light a lot during the pandemic, where the fundamental basis that we started with was the firm has a lot of the market power in private sector jobs. They want to squeeze as much profit as they can out of the workers. So the union is something to give the workers the ability to fight back, and maybe we settle somewhere in the middle. It's not obvious to me that the government is trying to similarly squeeze profit out of its workers in the same way.
Okay.
Is the government kind of a for-profit employer? I think probably not to the same degree, at least as individual as private firms are. And so
they're probably motivated by similar sort of forces, though, right? In terms of negotiating salaries and things like that, you're still
right. And I'm sure that there is some kind of delegation of funds to managers where they have a certain amount of money, and obviously if you can cut down the wages of one worker to get two workers instead of one, that's going to be beneficial. But the point I'm trying to make is just if the point of the union is to get kind of a more competitive outcome, the positive impact of a union on a labor market is going to be largest in a situation where without the union we would have this like strong profit incentive of the firm, and if that's not quite as high in the public sector, then the union might not achieve quite as much. Again, unionization I think is by and large a good thing. It does come with costs, right? And so one potential cost that we've seen with police unions and teachers unions recently is about a year and a half ago, after the murder of George Floyd, there was a whole lot of discussion about how reform of police hiring practices and punishing of police officers is difficult because of the union having power. With the teachers unions during the kind of later stages of the pandemic, where the teachers unions in Chicago and many places in California were basically shutting down the ability of people to go to school. Again, I'm not trying to take a stance. I'm just saying that this is really something that, regardless of the direction you take on this, the union has some power to cause disruptions in at least what other people, what some other people want to do. And so it's not without cost on the market as a whole either.
Okay, and that's actually a great segue to what I wanted to talk about next. Is
okay.
So like this collective bargaining power gives you not just the ability to affect your wages, but all these different things, right? That's what we saw with the police unions and the teachers. Like they were able to use their collective power to say that, okay, we don't want these reforms, we don't want these changes, not just higher salaries, right? And so when we think about, I guess, markets and what you want out of your job, it's not just the money that you get from it, right? There's all these other benefits and all these other things that we try and get from it. And a lot of them that we see today that we kind of take for granted or that we value came from either unionization or from government efforts sort of affecting the market in a specific way that maybe, like you said, unions were pretty unnatural, and a lot of the other things that we take for granted today, like let's say a 40-hour work week, weekends, things like that. A lot of these were sort of derived from collective bargaining, from government imposition, right? From all these different things. So so I think that segues nicely into some of those things. Let's talk about the government's effect and what it can do to markets, not just in terms of wages, but wages are a big one still. That's one thing that they do try to influence very specifically with targeted things like minimum wages, things like that. So actually let's just jump right into minimum wage and how the government can just set a market value for the labor that in that way, right?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that the role of government and collective action in general is important and has caused a lot of changes in the labor market and a lot of things that we kind of take for granted now. We can talk about minimum wage, and I think that's actually a particularly good one. One, because it's been kind of in the news, maybe earlier in the Biden administration's term, but something that kind of also plays into the different levels of competition, whether it's the competitive market outcome we have or the monopsony outcome that we have, and minimum wage has different predictions in those markets, and I think it's an interesting political topic. So happy to talk about that.
The concern, of course, is if you model minimum wage or the effect of minimum wage in your typical supply demand curve is, so you're driving up the price, that means you lower the demand for it, right?
That's right.
So, that's right. and that seems just sort of intuitively how we conceptualize and model these sort of classic economics. So you can talk to the truth of that, whether like labor actually acts in that way, because like my layman's understanding, drawing an analogy, there's different kinds of markets, right? Like I've taken one economics course, but there's like price elasticity, right? So something like, say, salt is kind of a classic example of like the market sets the price of salt at some value, and that's determined by competition. You're going to want to buy the cheaper salt, so that drives the cost down. But if the government were to come in and just say, okay, now salt costs twice as much, everyone's going to still buy the same amount of salt because it's such a small percentage, and it's such a small percentage of your spending, and everyone still needs and wants salt. And so our labor markets, or at least sort of like these unskilled, or like the minimum wage, or the market for these minimum wages, or is that similar, or is there something else going on, or is it just
I think you're making a great point. And you brought up the term elasticity, which we're thinking about the supply and the demand curves. This roughly corresponds to the slope of these things, right? So if we're in the kind of competitive outcome where we're at the point where supply equals demand, that's the market price, and the government comes in and sets a minimum wage above that, well, what's going to happen? Well, instead of the price being kind of at this intersection, the price is going to be somewhere higher. That means more workers are going to be willing to work at that wage, but fewer firms are going to be willing to hire as many workers. And so, two-way consent is needed to kind of create a job. And so what's going to happen is, sure, the wage is going to be higher, but fewer people are going to be hired. Okay. And the question of whether this is a good thing, well, if you're one of the workers who continues to be employed, right, it's a good thing. Your wage just went up. But you might also be one of the workers who didn't get employed, right? Who became unemployed. And the nice thing about the competitive outcome is that this is really it's the efficiency maximizing outcome, right? So we've created the largest pie possible, and it's being split somehow between the workers. Now, the question that the government has is the government might have other motives besides efficiency, right? It might actually care about how many, the wages of people, and that's where the elasticity comes in, right? So the relative slopes of these determines, well, if you increase the price by, you set a minimum wage that's 10% higher than kind of the market wage, how many firms are you going to dissuade from hiring workers? And that's really the margin that we care about, right? So if we lose, almost no, the firms are kind of like the salt example you were saying. The firms are still willing to hire almost the same number of workers they were able to hire before. Well, then, we've almost done something which akin to, basically just keeping the same amount of hiring, but just shifting, surplus from the firm from the workers, right? Okay. So that's where the elasticity comes in. It's the relative rate of how many jobs we kind of lose or create, lose by setting a higher.
Okay. And you said that's the slope. So basically, then you're saying these aren't necessarily just proportional. Like if you double the wages, you don't get half of the people buying it. Right. Totally
Right. And that's exactly the measure of the elasticity. It's saying something like, if you increase the wages by 1%, how much does how many more workers are willing to work, or how many fewer workers are the firm willing to hire? Yeah.
And this is probably a nonlinear relationship. I'm guessing like it probably is like pretty inelastic at some level, and then it gets more elastic.
That's right. And so the elasticity is defined at the starting point as well, right? And when we really talk about small changes, right? Because intuitively we're thinking of a derivative. So if you take the smallest possible increase in the wage, right, a millionth of a penny, how many fewer workers are going to be hired market-wide? So these kind of slopes, these elasticities, determine the magnitude of these effects, but not necessarily the direction, right? So the story I've told you is if we're in a competitive outcome, then an increase in minimum wage is going to result in lower employment. Mm-hmm. We don't know exactly how much lower. That's the notion of the elasticity, but we know that it's going to go down. But that's not necessarily the case in a monopsony market. Okay, right.
Yeah, that's kind of a you can talk about it if you want. That's kind of a complicated sort of explanation.
Yeah, so I think it's actually, it's a little bit more complicated, but maybe kind of similar, right? So if we have one firm that's buying all the labor, and it sets a profit maximizing very low wage. So what have they done? They've set a very low wage. They're not hiring as many workers, but they get a high profit per worker, and that turns out to be more than if they just done the overall market outcome. But it's resulting in this deadweight loss that I was talking about. Well, if the government comes in and sets the wages a little bit higher, what's going to happen? Well, the thing that's stopping the monopsonists from hiring more workers that are low wage is that the wages are too low. They're not incentivizing enough people to, the constraint is the number of workers who are willing to work. You raise the wages by 10%. Two good things happen now if you're on the side of the workers. One, the workers who are already hired get 10% higher wages. And two, well, you're now capturing more workers who are willing to work, right? The firm is still willing to hire all these workers at the new minimum wage, as long as the new minimum wage isn't too high, because, well, they were depressing the wages before. So now they say, okay, I don't like this, but I'm still willing to hire at this minimum wage. Exactly. And so if we have a monopsony market, then a minimum wage is kind of just a good thing for workers on in all aspects, right? Some workers who are hired before are getting higher wages. The workers who weren't hired before, some of them are now getting hired at wages that they're willing to pay for. And so that also is good for efficiency, because we're no longer in this kind of depressed market where the wages are too low. We're now kind of closer to the competitive outcome. So depending on the model of the world that you believe in, maybe there are differences across labor markets. A minimum wage that actually that increases the pay in the market can either be kind of a good thing or a bad thing from efficiency perspectives, and they're also kind of the worker issues about wages that you might care about even beyond this. But I think I think it's relatively uncontroversial if you said there's a monopsony market. Let's increase let's set a minimum wage that's a little bit higher than what the monopsony is paying. I think you would be hard pressed to find someone to say that's a bad idea.
And the really interesting thing about this is, so a lot of where we see monopsony markets are in like small rural towns. Maybe there's like one place to work, one factory, or like there's not a lot of jobs. And so when this minimum wage debate comes up, you often hear it like contextualized as like, okay, well, you can give people in the cities that minimum wage because the price is higher, the cost of living is higher, so it's okay for them. But you shouldn't give it to these rural people because all the costs are lower and things like that. But maybe it's the opposite of the way we should be thinking, that it actually makes sense to set these minimum wages in rural places, because that'll drive the wages up, and it'll, a lot of these places, people are moving out of these rural towns. A lot of them are dying, right? So maybe in some cases you actually want to increase the minimum wage, and it'll help these towns, right? It'll bring people back in.
I think that's an interesting point, and I don't know the answer to this, but I think the conditions for what you're saying to be true are something like small towns, by nature of the fact that there may be few employers, they have more monopsony power than big cities, and so therefore the quote unquote correct minimum wage is probably more helpful towards efficiency in these small towns than in the big cities. Now, having said that, I think a blanket minimum wage, maybe from a political standpoint, it's hard to say I'm going to create a national minimum wage and it's going to depend by area. That might be kind of harder to sell. But if this $15 minimum wage debate, I think the way that like a blanket minimum wage would work is unfortunately not going to kind of target the right way in all these areas, and saying nothing about the value of it, the number of it. But probably what's going to happen is, well, New York City, the wages are kind of very different from smaller town, let's say. Maybe there's a difference in monopsony power, but there are probably also bigger differences, right? And so I think what would happen is either the minimum wage is going to be so low that it's not going to bind in New York City, right? It's just below the market wage anyway. If everyone's already making at least $15 an hour, or almost everybody, then it's basically going to do nothing. Or it's going to be, so high that it's, whatever the going wage is in New York, maybe it's a, $30 minimum wage. And that might actually, cause labor issues where firms are not willing to hire at that, relatively high wage in a very rural area. So, I think that's a problem with a blanket minimum wage. But I think you're right that, I think it's possible that you're right that if there's kind of a larger degree of monopsony power in certain areas, then kind of an appropriately set minimum wage that kind of raises wages in that market is probably especially beneficial. Yeah.
So these are basically experiments that we can do, right? These are things that kind of based on your values as a political figure, you can say, I want this to happen, and maybe we can go test it in this market or something, right? And you can run on something like that.
I'm sure that somebody with a lot of political capital might be able to do that.
Right. It's not a popular thing.
I don't know to what extent policymakers are as interested in experimentation in policies as you might say.
Right.
So a lot of modern empirical research is exploiting differences in laws.
They don't create the laws for experiments. They create the laws for political pressures and political reasons.
So you might think
and then economists like to use them after the fact. But it would be great if the economists sometimes could write the laws for.
That's right. So you might think
of like experimental ends.
New York State passes a minimum wage law, and what do we look at how that works? Well, all the wages, maybe there's an increase in the minimum wages in New York State. So we might, compare a county on the border between, I don't know, Pennsylvania and New York that are similar otherwise. One of them sees an increase in minimum wage, and then we can, look at the differences across, across state lines to see what the effects are on these neighboring counties. Mm-hmm. Or we might, exploit that. Okay, well, the minimum wage is not going to really have any bite in New York City, but it might in Albany or something like that, and we can exploit differences there. So this is the kind of thing that, as we said, like the laws are not made for experiments, but we can try to salvage some experiments out of the laws.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Let's talk a few more things that the government kind of sets. We talked about the minimum wage and how that affects wages, but there's other things that we care about other than our wages. One thing, as I was looking for jobs, I thought was kind of fun to think about was there's a 40-hour work week, and that's kind of like the set standard. And I couldn't even imagine going to your employer and saying, okay, you gave me an offer and we're negotiating salaries. And what I'm actually negotiating is I don't want to work Fridays. Like that's not something that you can negotiate as an individual, right? They're just like, no, that's not on the table here, right?
Yeah.
But there were forces that got us to the 5-day work week, the 40-hour work week that we have now, and that wasn't from. So I assume this is sort of some unnatural sort of bargaining power, like the unionization that came from the government, and it only happens like if we want it as a population that can affect it through government.
Yeah. So I think you're right in that here the role of government is pretty strong, and recently many European countries that have stronger labor protections in many ways in the U.S. have actually lowered their the work week. So I think France or Finland maybe recently, I'm not sure, but I think maybe went to a 35-hour work week instead of 40. So yeah, absolutely, and I think that if you maybe you don't even have to go back too far in time to see situations of work weeks that were all day every day.
Yeah.
And I think there are economic and non-economic reasons why this.
As I was looking into this one, it's just a lot of tradition and things like that. Yeah. So like the reason we have the 8-hour shifts and like the 40-hour works is back from Ford, where he wanted his factories working all the time, so he had 8-hour shifts, and that kind of created
3 a day
8-hour shifts. And that's like we just kind of built our whole labor economy around this early tradition.
Yeah, and I think that you see a lot of differences by industry. So in medicine, for example, talking about this earlier, doctors and nurses in hospitals especially, they have these really, really long shifts where they kind of, I think there's been some effort to cut this down, but I think it's not unthinkable to basically have a shift that's 18 hours long, right? And you think, wow, why is that? And the reason there is that, I think a lot of patient problems happen during the trade-off between if one doctor comes in, they've been treating a patient, and well, there's some, they try to pass on their notes and discuss with the next doctor, but of course there's something lost with the trade-off. And so if you're trading off every 8 hours instead of every 18 hours, you have twice as many or slightly more trade-offs. And so that's a problem. Obviously, you can't have a doctor working for the entire duration of a patient's stay in the hospital, in the ER or something like that. But that's why the work day length is kind of different on a factory versus in medicine. But you're right that there's a lot of tradition that's built into this. There are a lot of laws that are built into this now. And you might also think that this has interactions with other forces like minimum wage, right? So if going back to the Ford example, if they're only allowed to hire people for 8 hours a day and they want to keep their factories going at all times, they need to hire more workers, right? And if you think that Ford was a monopsonist, he could pay low wages to people, and the minimum wage is, I'm sorry, if you set a minimum wage and you also kind of regulate the number of hours that people can work, you have to increase the number of people he hires as well, right? So you're spreading out the number of people who are able to get the job. So instead of hiring, 10 workers, he now has to hire 30 and pay them all the minimum wage. So that might also interact with those policies as well.
Okay. And then the last topic I have sort of under this broader topic is you study pay transparency, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so you can talk a little bit about that. I don't know a whole lot, just
Sure.
basically what it is, but go ahead. You can just go off and explain this.
So pay transparency is a measure of how much people know about the pay of their coworkers. And getting back to the monopsony model, you might think that this matters a lot, right? So what was the example we used? The cardiologist and the dermatologist. Well, there might be a lot of reasons why the cardiologist and the dermatologist, make different amounts. They might be very different in terms of the number of patients they treat or something like that. It might also be that for whatever reason, the cardiologist just has a high wage, even though they're worth the same amount, but because they lack information, the workers lack information on the pay of one another. They lack information about how much the firm is willing to pay for them. They just don't know, right? So I might be thinking I'm getting a fair wage, but you're doing a similar job. You're paid 20% more than me. And if I know that, well, that's some indication that the pockets of the employer are deeper than I thought, right? So it potentially can solve an information asymmetry between the firm and the worker. And then I can go on and I can say, hey, look, I know you're paying Matt 20% more than me. I know that we're worth the same amount to you. We're doing the same job. I'd like to have more money, and maybe I could threaten to sue for unequal pay for unfair pay practices, or I could go to the New York Times or something like that.
Yeah, right.
No, right. So it may allow workers, this information may allow workers to rebargain for higher wages. So that's one policy that the Obama administration pursued a decade ago, maybe a little bit more now.
Right. And both of those are sort of government imposed, both the ability to know and like the pay transparency law, but also the ability to sue then for wage discrimination. That's another government thing, right? That's something the government imposed, saying you're not allowed to pay people differently.
That's right. And actually, since 2004, I think something like 22 individual states have passed some form of pay transparency law. And I think something like 80 or 90% of these laws have been amendments to existing equal pay laws, right? So the equal pay laws typically say, it's unlawful for an employer to pay two workers who do substantially similar jobs different amounts based on race or sex or sexual orientation or disability, a whole number of things. And then, built into these, it's also, the amendment is also, firms can't punish workers for talking to one another about their wages, right? And so, I guess what I'm saying is you're absolutely right that to the extent that I'm able to negotiate a higher wage because I've learned something and I can threaten the firm if they don't, comply. That very much may be the case, and that seems to be the way that many of these laws are written as well, kind of mechanically, not maybe that wasn't like the grand plan, but that's the way that it's turned out. So that's a good observation. Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. And there's your papers talk about some of the issues that come in with pay transparency as well, that they can even drive wages down sometimes, right? That because really all of these things they're a negotiation, right? And what you're doing when you're talking about transparency or all these different laws that we pass is you're affecting the way in which people negotiate their wages here, right? And so there's different outcomes that happen based on these kind of externally imposed laws that change the way in which these negotiations happen, right?
That's right. So I can try to explain that in the context of the monopsony model if you're interested. I don't know how much time we have left.
Yeah, we can skip that a little bit.
Okay.
Let's just we can, I don't know, maybe we can get there, but let's talk. I do want to talk more about specifically then like how people negotiate, like specifically. So we talked about markets and all these general forces, and then let's just go into like, okay, you're an individual though. So I mean, you're a political person, maybe you're advocating for different political systems, but most of what people care about is like their job, their salary. How do they negotiate? How do they get more money? How do they see themselves in the market, and how do they kind of determine their own value in the market, right? So I don't know if this is more of a business person discussion.
No, I think it's a good starting point. So, when does negotiation happen? How do people negotiate? And going back to the earlier part of our conversation, it depends a lot on the kind of form of labor, right? So, as it turns out, in unskilled markets, there's very little wage negotiation, and there's a lot more wage posting, right? So it's just in the advertisement, everyone who works gets the same. Well, in skilled labor, typically that's not the case, or frequently that's not the case, where there's a bit of a back and forth. And you might think that that's based on market forces to begin with, right? So if all the workers are worth, if the workers are in some sense interchangeable, right? We're in an unskilled market, then, well, there's nothing really that you can negotiate or I can negotiate with the employer, right? We're just kind of, we're exactly cogs in the same machine, right? Whereas if I'm the cardiologist and you're the dermatologist, maybe there's, we're more on an equal playing field. No one gets to make the kind of take it or leave it offer to the other side. So there are differences in terms of the industry and unionization as well. So unionized workers frequently don't get to negotiate their pay on an individual level. There's all sorts of things that go into, conditional on being in a room negotiating with a manager or would-be manager. How does that happen? Well, a lot of it depends on the outside option of the worker. Do they have a fallback option? Can they go and make a startup? Can they go and start a podcast? Do they have another job, or are they kind of unemployed right now? And then when they're trying to get their job, it might be about information. So how much do they know about what other firms are paying? It might be about other factors like risk preferences, right? So if I'm a kind of a daredevil guy, I might be willing to push the envelope a little bit more than someone else who's not quite as much of a daredevil.
Sure, you risk turning them off, but you also
risk reward.
Right.
Yeah. So there are all sorts of factors that go into a negotiation. There are, recently
we can get to some of those. So just a little bit more there. So like, so I'm in the job market now on Indeed, and Indeed gives numbers. Like they say the majority of people who apply for jobs on Indeed don't even actually negotiate for their salary, even though the majority of hiring managers actually expect them to. And I don't know if that's some break in like our culture. We don't think of it. I mean, at least personally, I don't negotiate for prices of anything that I buy, really. I mean, maybe if I shop on eBay or something, but it's not really part of our culture like it is in other cultures, maybe. And we don't, maybe if you're a business person and you're negotiating deals lots, so you're kind of thinking that you're always kind of in this mindset that like prices are negotiable. I think probably a lot of people don't think that way. They kind of say like, this is the market. So the market sets the price. This is what I do. You see a job posting, you say, okay, this is what it's worth.
That's right.
And they'll just take it, right? But negotiating is like really important, actually. Like if you can get just a couple % more in your salary, that not just like for that year, maybe you get an extra $1,000, but that compounds. It affects with raises. Like just negotiating a little bit higher wages really can affect like long term how much money you make and your wealth and all these different things, right?
That's absolutely right. And this was there's a fair bit of investigation. I'm not saying that we know the answers yet, but I think this is something that maybe in the last 15-20 years people have thought a lot about, is how does the willingness to negotiate affect things like the gender gap, right? So there's evidence that women are penalized more when they negotiate, and they as a result, well, also that they anticipate that they're going to be penalized more if they negotiate. So as a result, women are maybe less willing to negotiate. And there's also even beyond this, there are thoughts about like, are men more competitive than women on average? Are men willing to take risks more often on average than women? And so the idea was, does this play a role in negotiation in terms of determining how much people are paid? But you're absolutely right that, it
So
doesn't just have to be gender, right?
Yeah, so there's all these
but
like
also,
societal factors then basically that aren't even market determined. They're just kind of like how we interact with people and
that's right.
how we
And
see them.
so there might be people who are, for whatever reason, they see the job posting or they see the Indeed posting and they think that's the number. I'm not gonna push the envelope, and there are other people who do. And the hiring managers may kind of be willing to negotiate with everyone, and some people negotiate and they get higher wages, and other people just kind of take it. And the hiring manager probably is not going to say, well, why don't you ask for more and I'll give it to you, right? That's probably not the most common tactic in a negotiation. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then when I was looking up things to do when you're negotiating, like there's all these websites that like to give you little tips, say, oh, you should do this and you'll get more money. And different business schools, different business journals and things like that. So I thought it'd be fun just to run through some of these and see like how they fit into what we were saying with like just our general understanding of how markets work, and then also like sort of how these interpersonal negotiations work, and whether like how valuable and like all the different things you should be thinking about when you're negotiating, either like a new job salary or looking to change jobs, or if you're negotiating a raise, just basically all these different things. So like the main thing, of course, is just to do what we've been talking about, is to understand your value in the market, is to try and is to compare yourself. Basically what you're doing when you're applying for a job or when you're setting your value is you're comparing yourself to people with similar skills as you. Like you're in a job market, you're looking for kind of more or less specific jobs, and those jobs are all within some price range, and so you're looking at this value of jobs and competing with other people that probably have similar skills. But basically just understanding your value is sort of the most important thing.
I think I agree with that. I mean, I think maybe there are two kind of broadly important things. So one is kind of knowing the size of the pie that you're negotiating over. That's how much value to create. Obviously, more information about that is going to allow you to tailor what you're asking for. I mean, if you're asking for a $10 million salary for a job, for my job, they're going to say no, right? That more information that's way too high a number is would be good. So there's some role of kind of information, knowing the value, how big is the pie that we're bargaining over, and the other is kind of, if I knew the size of the pie, what are ways that I can get more of it for me than for you, right? What are tactics there? And so I think maybe those are two different ways or two different aspects of negotiating that are potentially important. Yeah.
And then another important thing is to ask specifically like what's negotiable here. Like, is your salary negotiable, or are different benefits negotiable, or time off? All these different things contribute to quality of life, to the quality of your job. And maybe some jobs are more willing to give you time off or work from home than other jobs. Like, it's not their default, but maybe you can get away with kind of asking for different things depending on the type of job that you're applying to, right?
Yeah. And that's kind of, I think, related to the knowing your value sort of thing. I mean, it's maybe not value exactly, but it's something like knowing what the dimensions are over which we can negotiate, and maybe also learning something about the relative areas where, maybe it's, maybe the wage is fixed, but we can negotiate commission or something like that. Or maybe the wage is fixed, but we can negotiate kind of, a company car or something. There may be dimensions along which, it may be more fruitful to kind of push on some dimensions than others, and knowing what that is probably useful. Yeah.
They say likability is actually underrated in these sort of interactions. Just coming off as a personable or attractive person, of course, right? People judge you. These are interpersonal negotiations, and so just the way you interact is important, because you're going to be working with these people.
Yeah, I think the other thing that maybe is worth keeping in mind also is that companies, especially big companies, they're kind of, there's a lot of delegation of tasks, right? So the person who's hiring and setting wages may not be the person paying the bill at the end of the day, right?
Exactly.
And so it may be that the manager is willing to give you a 5% higher salary, or the hiring manager is willing to give you a 5% higher salary, because, well, they have, whatever, they're hiring 10 people that day. You smile, the other one doesn't smile. You seem like a nice guy, the other one doesn't seem like a nice guy. they don't really care, right? It's not like money out of their pocket directly, and so I could certainly see how likability would play a big role there. Yeah, it's a good tip. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And there's a few more ones that just seem sort of silly, but I think that's a pretty good. We can end it, or at least our main discussion there. I think that it's
Okay.
a pretty good summary of just like, I don't even know if we answered our initial question of whether you're paid what you're worth, or what it's certainly what you negotiate. Like that's at least a
Yeah.
very important factor. So
I think the
negotiating
answer might be it depends. Yeah.
it depends. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So at least I think I have a better picture of like that discussion now. And I don't know if I were to be part of that discussion, I don't know which word I would even use to frame it, and say like, oh, you're paid what you're worth. It's like, okay, I don't know the best simplified version of way to say that, but at least we have an understanding, if not the language for it. Right. Yeah. And then just one more thing I wanted to add. Again, I'm not an economist. I haven't studied Marx, but like we're talking about labor and stuff like that. So I figure we have to at least bring some Marx's theory of labor here and his opinions on it, because he was kind of a radical, and but his ideas are still around, and he had a lot to say about labor, right? So my understanding of it is that there's different classes. You have an owning class and a laboring class, and if you're in the laboring class, by default in a capitalist economy, you're not going to get paid what you're worth, because somebody else is owning the means of production, and the only way they can make money is to take some of the value of the labor that you're doing.
And to some extent that's definitely true. In his notion of the value of labor, or the value of a good, really is how much labor is necessary to create that good, right? And there you might think, okay, well, if there's a factory, and the factory can't run without people, and there's a certain price that the good sells for, and there is, I think, a reasonable question as to who should get, like from a moral sense, who should get
exactly. Yeah, this is all moralized.
How much of the money?
Definitely.
And Marx's point, I think broad points, was something like, well, it should be the moral value is kind of 100% on the part of the worker. And so anything that's less than that is the capitalist squeezing the worker. And so, but as a result, like his definition of what an object was worth was just how much labor went into it. And I think this is kind of it's kind of an attractive notion. It also kind of, I think in a lot of senses, it seems to be at least close to the truth, right? Like something that you put more effort into should cost more. But that differs from kind of the way we think about prices and values in general, which is typically about preferences. So what I mean to say is, I could put a lot of effort into making a painting versus, an artist who just is naturally talented. I have very little like art, kind of artistic ability. And it's not going to be the same painting, right? And and maybe you say, well, there's a whole lot of training and practice that goes into the artist's time and stuff, which is fine. But then you're kind of, we're creating some kind of value, right? Like some kind of value judgment, which is there is some kind of art that is better or more desired or higher value or something like that than others. And that's, I think, what most economists now kind of start uses their basis, which is there are some preferences. The preferences determine willingness to pay, and it's not just labor that determines these things.
Okay, sounds good. That's all I wanted to say about Marx. We can talk a little bit. We can talk a little bit about your own research. You can kind of promote yourself and your ideas here. I'll just ask you some questions about that, and we can just go.
Yeah. There. Well, I wonder if I could say, I thought a little bit about this. Three areas where I think, three kind of like hot labor areas that I think that we might want to know more about going forward. Maybe your audience will be interested in hearing that. And I'm happy to.
Are these things you're researching, or you're trying to get grants for research?
To some extent me, and to some extent others. Yeah, so I think there's a fair bit of importance, as we're talking about the bargaining, about knowledge when it comes to bargaining. So knowledge about how much you're worth, knowledge about what the firm is paying other workers, knowledge about what you could make at other places, right? And there might be tremendous asymmetries between firm and worker here. and maybe kind of more knowledge will affect the labor market in a profound way. There are government policies. So some recent ones, we talked about a little bit about minimum wage. Something that many areas are talking about now are things like salary history bans, or firms allowed to ask you how much you are making. And you might think, well, if they're able to do that, they'll just pay you $1 more than your previous employer is paying you, and you'll jump ship, and right. And the fear is that current employers might do something like what's called first degree price discrimination, which is I open your head up, find out exactly what the minimum amount you're willing to work for is, and I'll pay you $1 more than that, right?
And that's all determined just by more information, or at least you can get a better idea of that just with more and more information. And
so there are important labor market policies that are worth studying. And I think the third thing is understanding the role of families and childcare and marriage decisions in terms of labor market outcomes. So there's a tremendous amount of research recently in terms of what happens to mothers after they have kids. Where does the wage gap turn up in the life cycle? A lot of that appears to be related to childcare. There are questions about kind of how different people, how different amounts of flexibility in the workplace, maybe that's coupled with childcare, can affect the wage gap as well. So I think these are some kind of interesting things to think about, and I think maybe more people can think about them, and that would be a good thing.
Sound good? Anything else you want to talk about?
No, that was great. That was a lot of fun.
Okay, good. We can end it there.